In this part of the course, you'll learn about external bleeding. Workplace injuries can often result in external bleeding. Bleeding injuries can occur anywhere and at any time. Most bleeding is minor and can be treated without advanced help. Getting the first aid kit is an important step to control bleeding quickly. Because it will contain the dressings, bandages, gloves, and manufactured tourniquet you may need to render first aid. It's important to stay calm, as bleeding often looks worse than it is, and most bleeding can be stopped with pressure. With all bleeding injuries, your first action should be to identify 2 factors to guide your care. 1. The amount of bleeding, and 2. The location of the bleeding. Minor bleeding occurs from small cuts or scrapes and is easily controlled often with a simple adhesive bandage. For minor cuts anywhere on the body, wash the area with soap and water, and then apply a dressing to the wound. Once the bleeding has stopped, you can apply an antibiotic ointment if the person has no known allergies and an adhesive bandage. This method has been proven to help wounds heal faster and more effectively. For more severe wounds, it may be necessary to use bandages, dressings, or a manufactured tourniquet. A dressing is a clean material used directly on a wound to stop bleeding. If you do not have a first aid kit, or your kit does not contain gauze dressings, you can use any other clean piece of cloth. A bandage is material used to protect or cover an injured body part. A bandage may also be used to help keep pressure on a wound. If necessary, you can hold gauze dressings in place over a wound with a bandage. A manufactured tourniquet should also be included in your first aid kit. They come in several different styles, so you should become familiar with what your kit includes. If the wound is bleeding more than can easily be stopped with an adhesive bandage, you will need to determine whether it is non-life-threatening or life-threatening bleeding. Consider a wound to be life-threatening if the flow of blood is continuous and steady, and if the volume of loss appears large, about equal to half of a 12-ounce can. You do not want to wait for blood to accumulate to take action, as cuts that may seem more moderate at first can become severe if the person is on certain types of blood-thinning medications, like aspirin. It is important to not underestimate the amount of blood loss and be prepared to take action. With any bleeding, these are the steps you should take. First, make sure the scene is safe. Be sure you and the injured person are safe from whatever caused the bleeding. Then, send someone to get the first aid kit. If possible, have the person apply direct pressure to the injury while you are quickly gathering supplies. Put on gloves as soon as they are available. If the bleeding is non-life-threatening, apply a dressing to the bleeding area. Put direct pressure on the dressings using the heel of one hand, with the other hand stacked on top of the first. If possible, keep your arms straight while applying pressure downward onto the wound. Direct pressure should be firm, steady, and constant. Do not remove pressure from the wound to add more dressings. Also, do not remove a dressing once it's in place because this could cause the wound to bleed more. Continue holding firm pressure until help arrives or the bleeding stops. Releasing pressure too soon can allow the wound to start bleeding again. If the bleeding does not stop, press harder. Keep pressure on the wound until it stops bleeding. Once the bleeding stops, or if you cannot keep pressure on the wound, wrap a bandage firmly over the dressings to hold them in place. A person with bleeding should be seen by a healthcare provider as soon as possible because the person may need stitches or a tetanus shot. You've just learned the steps for providing first aid for non-life-threatening bleeding. But what if the injury is more severe? Life-threatening bleeding can occur from a variety of traumatic injuries like car accidents, cuts from glass, accidents involving saws or other tools, knife penetration injuries, gunshot wounds, or falls from a height. You should always phone your local emergency response number first when there is life-threatening bleeding. If the person has life-threatening bleeding on an extremity, like an arm or leg, you will need to use a tourniquet. The first aid kit may contain a pre-made or manufactured tourniquet. If it does not, we recommend adding it to your kit, especially if your workplace meets the requirements of Class B locations. There are different types of manufactured tourniquets. For the purposes of this course, let's look at how to apply a windlass rod-style manufactured tourniquet. First, Apply the tourniquet 5 to 8 centimeters above the bleeding site on the person's arm or leg, closer to the heart. Do not place the tourniquet on a joint, such as a knee or elbow. Go above the joint if necessary. Next, pull the free end of the tourniquet to make it as tight as possible and then secure. Then, twist the windlass or knob until bleeding stops. You need to twist the windlass as tight as possible to stop life-threatening bleeding. Tightening will often cause pain, but it will minimize blood loss. Finally, secure the windlass and note the time the tourniquet was applied. If a manufactured tourniquet is not available, and direct manual pressure with or without the use of a hemostatic dressing does not stop life-threatening bleeding, a first aid provider trained in the use of an improvised tourniquet may consider using one. If the person continues to bleed after you have applied a manufactured tourniquet, apply a second manufactured tourniquet above the first, closer to the heart. If they continue to bleed or a second tourniquet is not available, pack the wound and apply pressure as follows. If the bleeding is life-threatening and is located on a body part that is not the arm or leg, like the head, neck, chest, or abdomen, you should pack a wound and then apply pressure. Packing can also be done if the tourniquet does not stop the bleeding in the arms and legs. Packing the wound means taking a material like gauze or clean cloth and placing it tightly into the wound. Continue to apply direct pressure until the bleeding stops. Stop the Bleed is a national awareness campaign and call to action that encourages bystanders to become trained, equipped, and empowered to stop or reduce severe bleeding before professional help arrives. The AHA supports raising awareness about Stop the Bleed's efforts to minimize injury and death caused by blood loss. If you're interested in more information on this campaign, including additional resources, visit stopthebleed.usuhs.edu.